What would you do if you were sent to fight a tiger and your only weapon was a stick? If your commanders told you your stick was just as good, that it was all about how you used it, but you'd seen what the tiger's claws could do? For the American tankers of the 4th Armored Division in the autumn of 1944, this wasn't a metaphor. Their stick was the M4 Sherman tank. The tiger was the German Panzer V, the Panther, and they were about to face 300 of them in a battle that should have been a massacre. Most generals, men like Montgomery and even the cautious Bradley, said it was time to stop, to consolidate, to build up supplies. But their commander, George S. Patton, only had one word in his vocabulary: attack. Everyone thought he was stretching his army to the breaking point. They thought he was reckless. They were right. His tanks were running on fumes. His men were exhausted after a 600-mile blitz across France. The Germans, reeling from their defeat at Normandy, were laughing. Not openly, but with a quiet, confident malice. Hitler himself had ordered a massive counterattack, a blow designed not just to stop Patton, but to encircle and annihilate his entire Third Army. They had the numbers, they had the superior technology, and they had the weather, a thick, impenetrable fog that would blind the most powerful weapon in the Allied arsenal: air power. But the Germans didn't know who they were facing. They didn't know about the quiet tactical genius of Major General John Wood, or the ferocious battlefield instincts of a lieutenant colonel named Creighton Abrams. They didn't know that in the fog-drenched fields of Lorraine, a handful of outgunned American tankers would not only halt the most powerful armored assault on the Western Front, but turn it into one of the most lopsided victories in the history of warfare. This is a story about how the wrong tools in the right hands can be more dangerous than the right tools in the wrong ones, and what happens next will blow your mind. But quick, if you want more stories of courage, sacrifice, and the untold side of World War II, smash that subscribe button. Trust me, next video's story is even more unbelievable. This is a story told in 5 interwoven threads, a tapestry of mud, steel, and desperation. The first thread is Patton's grand gamble, his obsessive, borderline insane drive to smash through the German lines and end the war by Christmas, even if it meant outrunning his own supply lines and risking his entire army. The second thread is the 4th Armored Division, the very tip of Patton's spear, now stuck in the mud of a region called Lorraine, exhausted, low on fuel, and directly in the path of a Panzer hurricane. The third thread is the German counteroffensive, a desperate, meticulously planned operation under the command of one of their best panzer generals, Hasso von Manteuffel, aimed at cutting off and destroying the head of the American serpent. The fourth thread is the brutal, unforgiving technological mismatch. The American Sherman, a reliable, mass-produced workhorse with a gun that struggled to penetrate German armor, versus the German Panther, a purpose-built predator with sloped armor that deflected American shells and a high-velocity cannon that could kill a Sherman from over a mile away. And the fifth thread, the most crucial, is the weather. The constant, chilling rain and the thick, disorienting fog that blanketed the battlefield, grounding the P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers and turning a modern war into a blind, knife fight in a phone booth. The primary mystery is simple. How could a force that was so completely outmatched on paper not just survive, but win so decisively? But beneath that lay a dozen other questions. Would Patton's supply lines hold? Could the Sherman crews invent tactics on the fly to compensate for their technological inferiority? Would the German commanders, so confident in their machines, make a fatal mistake? And looming over everything was the biggest question of all, whispered in every command tent and every tank turret. When would the damned fog lift? The oscillation between hope and despair began the moment the first Panther emerged from the mist. The first taste of failure was brutal and immediate. On the morning of September 18, 1944, near the town of Arracourt, the Germans attacked. They came out of the fog like ghosts, their powerful engines a low rumble that was felt before it was heard. The American tankers of Combat Command A of the 4th Armored Division were caught in a vulnerable position, their Shermans silhouetted on a ridgeline. The first crack of the Panther's long 75mm gun was a sound of absolute authority. An American shell would hit a Panther's frontal armor with a loud clang and bounce off. A German shell would hit a Sherman, and the Sherman would cease to exist, erupting into a column of fire and black smoke. The crews called their tanks Ronsons, after the popular cigarette lighter, because they lit up on the first strike. In the first few minutes of the engagement, the American lines buckled. Panic flickered over the radios. It was exactly what the German planners had envisioned, a clean surgical strike that would shatter the American spearhead. The viewer's emotional state is immediate anxiety, the dread of seeing the underdog about to be crushed. But then, a flicker of success. The Americans did not break. They were not elite SS zealots. They were citizen soldiers, but they were veterans of the breakout from Normandy. They were adaptable. They were angry. And they were brilliantly led. They rapidly implemented a terrifying but effective new doctrine, born of desperation. The orders crackled over the radio. Don't slug it out. Move. Flank them, get on their sides, shoot them in the ass. The Shermans used their one key advantage: speed and a fast traversing turret. While the Panther was a sniper, a hunter, it was also sluggish. Its turret turned slowly. The Shermans became a swarm of angry bees, racing around the German predators, trying to get a shot at their weaker side and rear armor. A mini-success followed. A single Sherman, juking and weaving, managed to get alongside a Panther and fire a round into its flank. The German behemoth shuddered to a halt, smoke pouring from its engine deck. It was possible. The monster could be killed. The emotional state shifts to hopeful. But this was immediately countered by the crushing reality of numbers. For every Panther they managed to knock out, 2 more would loom out of the fog. The American losses were mounting. This was a battle of attrition they could not win. The viewer is thrown back into a state of dread. The scale of the German attack was far larger than they had anticipated. This wasn't a probe. This was an annihilation blow. This forced a new kind of information to be revealed, a revelation that changed the entire understanding of the battlefield. The American way of war was not about one-on-one duels. It was a system, a combined arms orchestra, and the conductor was artillery. While the Shermans were desperately fighting for their lives, a network of forward observers, hidden in church steeples or flying in tiny L4 grasshopper spotter planes underneath the fog layer, were calling in hellfire. The American 105mm and 105mm howitzers were the great equalizer. They were accurate, fast-firing, and available in massive numbers. The Germans had planned a tank battle. The Americans were fighting a combined arms battle. This reframed the fight. It wasn't just Sherman versus Panther. It was Sherman plus artillery plus infantry versus Panther. This change in understanding opened a new question. Could this system defeat a technologically superior foe, even without its most powerful component, air power? This forced a decision on the German commander, Manteuffel. His plan relied on speed and shock, but the American artillery was breaking up his formations, forcing his tanks to disperse, slowing the advance. His choice was stark. Push through the artillery fire and risk devastating losses, or pause and regroup, giving the Americans time to strengthen their defenses. He chose to push. It was a decision that would have cascading consequences. The relationship between the two armies shifted. The Germans began with the arrogance of a predator. Now, a grudging respect was forming. These Americans were not the soft, decadent soldiers of Nazi propaganda. They were clever. They were resilient. But the relationship between Patton and his frontline commander, John Wood, was also beginning to shift. Patton, miles from the front, saw only the map. He demanded constant forward momentum. Wood saw the brutal reality. He saw his men dying, his tanks burning. He knew his division was on the verge of collapse. The first seeds of a conflict between the aggressive grand strategist and the pragmatic battlefield commander were sown. All of this was deepening the personal connection for the viewer. Anyone who has ever been given a task with inadequate tools, who has been told to make it work against impossible odds, could feel the desperation of the Sherman crews. The fear connection was palpable. The claustrophobia of being inside a steel box, knowing that a single hit from an unseen enemy could turn it into your coffin. And the aspirational connection was forming around the leaders on the ground, men like Creighton Abrams, whose calm, decisive commands in the heart of the chaos were the only thing holding the line together. The pressure chamber intensified. This wasn't a single day of fighting. Arracourt was a sprawling, brutal affair that lasted for nearly 2 weeks. Every 2 minutes of the narrative, the stakes escalated. What began as a threat to a single division became a threat to Patton's entire Third Army. By day 3, the Germans were still attacking, probing, trying to find a weak spot. The pressure was immense. The American tankers were getting little to no sleep, living off adrenaline and coffee, constantly moving, constantly fighting. The mystery of the weather continued, a constant, oppressive presence. Every morning began with the same desperate hope. Will it clear today? And every morning, the answer was the same. A wall of gray. A 5-day, then a 10-day delay for the answer, stretching the tension to its absolute breaking point. The oscillations between success and failure became faster, more violent. The Americans would win a tactical victory, destroying a dozen Panthers in a clever ambush. Success. But then they would discover that the Germans were simply bypassing that strongpoint and attacking from a new, unexpected direction. Failure. The M18 Hellcat tank destroyers arrived. Incredibly fast vehicles with powerful guns. Success. But their armor was so thin that a German machine gun could chew them to pieces, and they were few in number. Failure. These faster oscillations created a higher emotional intensity, a sense of chaotic whiplash mirroring the experience of the soldiers themselves. All the plot lines were now at high tension. Patton's gamble was on a knife edge. If the 4th Armored broke, his army would be cut in 2. Wood's division was reaching the limits of human endurance. Manteufel's offensive was behind schedule and taking heavy losses, but he was still pushing, still dangerous. The technological mismatch remained a constant source of terror. And the weather was unchanged. The consequences began to cascade. The persistent fog meant the P-47s remained grounded. This meant the full weight of stopping the German armor fell on the ground forces. This meant that artillery ammunition was being expended at a terrifying rate. This meant that the supply lines, already stretched to the limit by Patton's advance, were now being asked to deliver tens of thousands of shells on top of fuel and food. A single problem, the weather, was creating a logistical crisis that threatened to cripple the entire American effort, even if they won the tactical fight. But to keep the viewer from being completely overwhelmed by dread, micro-mysteries were constantly being resolved. How did they refuel the tanks in the middle of a battle? Answer: they used small jeeps with fuel cans, zipping across the battlefield under fire. Who was the top American ace of the battle? Answer: a sergeant named Lafayette Poole, who would be credited with destroying over 250 enemy vehicles before he was grievously wounded. These small dopamine hits of information kept the viewer locked in, providing tiny islands of certainty in a sea of chaos, while the big questions, will they survive, will the fog lift, continued to build unbearable pressure. Then, the convergence, the breaking point. The moment where all systems fire simultaneously. Manteufel, under immense pressure from Hitler, gathered his remaining forces for one final, desperate assault. His target was the town of Château-Salins, a key crossroads that, if captured, would effectively trap the 4th Armored Division. All 5 plot lines reached their crisis at the exact same moment. Patton's strategic gamble was down to its last card. If Château-Salins fell, his campaign was over, a humiliating failure. The 4th Armored Division, under the direct command of Creighton Abrams, was at its absolute physical and psychological limit. They had been fighting for 11 straight days. Manteufel's offensive was in its death throes. This was his last reserve, his final roll of the dice. The technological mismatch was at its most acute, as weary American crews in patched-up Shermans faced the last fresh wave of German Panthers. And the weather was, if anything, worse. A cold, driving rain had been added to the thick fog. All pressure types were converging. The temporal pressure of a final do-or-die attack, the environmental pressure of the mud and the fog, the strategic pressure of the entire Western Front, the humanitarian pressure on men who were long past their breaking point, and the personal pressure on Abrams and Manteufel, two brilliant commanders locked in a final, decisive duel. For this period, the oscillation is paused. For what feels like an eternity, there is no relief, only sustained, negative tension. The German assault began. Their armor, supported by infantry, slammed into the thinly held American lines. The radio traffic became a desperate cacophony of frantic calls for support, reports of tanks being hit, of positions being overrun. The American artillery fired until the barrels of the guns were glowing red hot, but still the Germans came on. It seemed inevitable. The line was going to break. The viewer is at the breaking point, a neurochemical storm of maximum cortisol and peak norepinephrine, desperate for a resolution, for any kind of relief. And then, the cascade. All the systems resolving in a coordinated lightning-fast sequence. The first domino fell. On the morning of September 29th, after 11 days of impenetrable gloom, the fog began to thin. A patch of blue appeared, then another. The sun broke through. The single greatest mystery and source of pressure in the entire battle was resolved. The viewer's cortisol begins to plummet. Endorphins begin to release. The reaction is a single explosive word. Finally. This triggered the second domino. Air power. The call went out to every forward air base in the region. The weather is clear over Arracourt. The hunt is on. The impact was immediate and devastating. Within the hour, the sky was full of American P-47 Thunderbolts. They came in low, their engines screaming. The pilots, who had been grounded for weeks, were filled with a cold fury. They saw below them what looked like a target range. German tank columns, completely exposed on the open roads, with no cover and almost no anti-aircraft defenses. They strafed the infantry. They hit the supply trucks, and they went after the Panthers with 500-pound bombs and high-velocity rockets. A second, massive dopamine hit for the viewer, combined with the grim satisfaction of schadenfreude. The predator was now the prey. The third domino was the German collapse. The psychological shock of the air attacks was total. An army that had been on the verge of a breakthrough was suddenly being dismantled from the air. Their advance stalled completely. Without the protective blanket of bad weather, their technological superiority was rendered moot. A Panther was just as vulnerable to a 500-pound bomb as a Jeep. The attack faltered, then turned into a full-blown, panicked retreat. The strategic threat was eliminated. The viewer feels a surge of serotonin, a sense of justice, of order being restored. The fourth domino was the relief of the 4th Armored Division. As the Germans reeled back, the American tankers, infantry, and artillery, now with total control of the sky above them, went on the offensive. They pursued the retreating Germans relentlessly. The battle was over. The siege was lifted. The humanitarian crisis of the division's imminent collapse was averted. The viewer experiences a peak of oxytocin. The men they have been following, the underdogs, have survived. The fifth domino was redemption and vindication. The American combined arms doctrine was proven devastatingly superior to the German focus on brute force technology. The tactical genius of Wood and Abrams was undeniable. The Sherman, the much-maligned Ronson, had been part of a system that had defeated a force of superior tanks. The question of crazy or genius was resolved. The American system was genius. The viewer feels a surge of vicarious vindication. I knew they could do it. And the final, sixth domino, historical significance. The Battle of Arracourt was the largest tank battle on the Western Front until the Battle of the Bulge, and it was an unbelievably lopsided American victory. The 4th Armored Division had destroyed nearly 280 German tanks and assault guns, while losing fewer than 50 of their own. It was a stunning achievement, but in a final twist of irony, it was almost immediately overshadowed. While the 4th Armored was fighting for its life, a massive Allied operation called Market Garden was failing spectacularly in the Netherlands. The press and history focused on the dramatic failure and largely ignored the stunning success. Arracourt became one of the great forgotten victories of the war. The victory at Arracourt should have been a turning point. It had decimated 2 of Germany's best panzer brigades and blunted Hitler's ability to counterattack. But the final, cruelest enemy was not the German army. It was logistics. Patton's relentless advance had finally, definitively, outrun his supplies. The Red Ball Express could not keep up. His tanks, the ones that had survived Arracourt, soon sat silent, their fuel tanks empty. The halt gave the Germans the one thing they desperately needed: time. Time to retreat, to regroup, to rebuild their shattered armored divisions. Hasso von Manteuffel, the brilliant German general defeated at Arracourt, had learned a series of incredibly valuable lessons. He learned that American artillery was devastating. He learned that American tactical leadership was superb. But most importantly, he learned that without air power, the Americans were vulnerable. And that fog was his single greatest ally. The Allies believed he was a spent force, a defeated general. They were wrong. As the winter of 1944 set in, Manteuffel was given a new secret command. He would take the lessons learned in the mud of Lorraine and apply them on a massive, strategic scale. His objective: to lead the main armored thrust in a new last-ditch German offensive, an attack so audacious, so daring, it would stun the world. He would wait for the worst possible weather, for a week of impenetrable fog and snow, to ground the Allied air forces once again. And he would strike where the Americans were weakest, through the dense forests of the Ardennes. The Battle of Arracourt was over, but for the men of the 4th Armored Division and for their commander, George Patton, the real test was just beginning. The lessons of their greatest victory were about to become the blueprint for their enemy's most dangerous gamble. How Manteuffel used the memory of his defeat at Arracourt to orchestrate the Battle of the Bulge, and how Patton's men would be called upon, once again, to save the day against impossible odds. That is a story for another time.